Okay, so this discussion is gonna look at energy system specificity, and we've talked a lot about energy systems, even in other courses. But the idea being that the bulk of your energy system training, or what we would classically even just call conditioning or metabolic conditioning, is really dependent upon the requirements of the sports. Not only should the training, but also the testing should also coincide with this as well. So we're going to look at the various properties of the energy systems and talk about some other considerations we need to look at in programming. So just some considerations. Again, when we look at energy system training, there's a lot of things to look at. So you have to consider the rate at which the athletes are working, the duration of the activity, and your work recovery ratio. So again, when you look at things that are actually happening in sports, so if we take probably two of the biggest things you could compare and contrast, running a 100-meter dash in under 10 seconds, or running a 26.2 mile in under 2 hours. For these respective sports, those are both very fast times, but when you're considering what's getting done, from the rate at which energy is being produced, the overall duration of the event, you're obviously looking at two extreme examples when we're talking energy systems. So now it gets a little bit more complicated when we talk about field-based sports, but that's why it's important to kind of look at like time motion analyses and things like that to really see like what are the work recovery ratios and what are the actual volumes that a lot of athletes tend to run at. So when we look at rate and duration of energy production, so in looking at this, we look at two things. One, we look at power. So power is the rate of change in energy, okay? So for instance, we look at Olympic weightlifting, a lot of energy gets produced in a very short amount of time, okay? And with all of our energy systems, we have a power component to it. You also have capacity. Capacity looks at basically how much fuel is getting used, okay? So when we're looking at all three of our energy systems, which everybody, I believe in this class, has already been exposed to the energy systems, not only do you have the energy systems getting used, but you have them getting used for both power and capacity purposes, okay? And again, the highest rates of energy production are going to be typically done during your anaerobic-based events because they're being done at such a high intensity when talking about that power component. So when we look at work to rest rate recovery ratios, because this is another thing that we kind of look at, we look at both anaerobic and aerobic contributions, okay? So in pure endurance sports, there really is no recovery. So if you look at your middle and long distance running, there really is no recovery because it's just running for the extended period of time. So, but then in all your other sports, you're typically looking at, a work to rest ratio because they're not working at a constant pace. So that's something important to consider when you're looking at this. So you look at the energy systems profile, okay? So again, you look at all the different sports like weightlifting, powerlifting, short sprints, team sports, combat sports, marathons. You look at what you're basically doing for your energy systems profile in your sports, because then that's going to dictate your programming for your metabolic conditioning. And again, most of the athletes we're going to be dealing with are going to be in mixed sports. So there's a balance between rate and duration, okay? Mixed sports is where more planning is required because you have to kind of consider the fact that really they are using multiple energy systems, but you have to make sure they're being trained appropriately, okay? And keep in mind, the shorter the recovery periods and the longer the work periods, the sport becomes more aerobic in nature, okay? And also particularly as the duration increases as well. So that's another quality that you look at to determine how much the aerobic system plays a role with the individual sports. So here's just a little thing, a little outline going when you're talking about the different components of training throughout the year. So your general developmental, your specific developmental, pre-competitive, and competition. So again, general developmental, which takes up a good portion of the off-season training program. The primary movements don't need to replicate the sports skill. Your focus is more on just central adaptive changes in general training means, and this is going to typically follow the competitive season. Specific developmental uses the same muscle groups and general movement patterns of the sport, and the majority of the energy system production should come from the dominant demands of the sport. Then you get into the pre-competitive and competitive components of the training year. So pre-competitive would be that kind of immediate, pre-season time frame where again you now have to prioritize much more specificity, and that's going to really prepare the body for the upcoming season. And then competition, you're really using the sport as the primary training means, and your non-specific training at that point becomes accessory work. So this is kind of looking at your long-term programming and how important that is in your training, and making sure that you're incorporating the means of training and making sure that the highest volume goes towards based upon where they're at within the year. So the general preparatory phase, so the timing, this is several months before the competitive season. And this is particularly beneficial after a long sports season to have a really good general preparatory phase. Your primary goals in this is to develop the components of the energy system function necessary to support higher level of energy production and performance, okay? So your programming, when you're looking at this, your general training exercises, they don't need to replicate anything about sports-specific training. And here we're just looking for general physical development. From the aerobic standpoint, you're really just looking at the cardiovascular system's ability to deliver oxygen, okay? If it is an aerobic dominant sport, you're obviously going to have a higher volume, but even in your sports where you don't think of it classically as aerobic dominant, you could still include some aerobic work. Again, from the anaerobic standpoint, you're looking at the more central aspects of anaerobic power output related to the central nervous system. And in particular here, you're looking at more strength and size. Again, for your mixed sports, it depends. And again, the vast majority of the sports we deal with are going to be mixed, but you're just going to have to kind of look at, what they did during the season, and then kind of plan your training period appropriately. Okay, that takes us into the specific preparatory phase. So again, here we're looking towards using slightly more specific exercises and movement patterns. Now again, here we're just looking at using the same muscle groups. Okay, so same muscle groups, same ranges of motion, but we're not looking to necessarily replicate skills. Okay, and really again, in most of training regarding strength and conditioning, you really don't look to replicate skills per se with your conditioning. Obviously, like for sprinters and their sprinting, that's one thing, and that would be incorporated in their practices anyway. But for the most part, in a lot of your sports, you're not necessarily looking to do that. The timing here, you look at several months from the season, and the goal here is to serve as a bridge between the very general work and the most specific work, which would be what you're getting to into the season. Programming wise, you're looking to improve the functional energy system production within the working muscles. Again, we want to use movement patterns that are going to be inherent to the skills of the sport. This doesn't mean that the skill needs to be precisely replicated, okay? So we're looking at exercises that are biomechanically similar to the skills of the sport, looking at range of motion, patterns of resistance. This is something where, from a strengthening perspective, something we're going to look at later on called special strengths really comes into play. But from an energy system perspective, we're looking at, getting it as close to the true specific competitive nature of the sport when we're looking at conditioning. So looking at the pre-competitive phase, so again, this is the period that's going to precede the competitive season. Most often you're looking at about a month or two before the start of the competitive preseason camp is going to be the pre-competitive phase. So this is where the work done in the previous two phases have really the biggest impact on sport skills. Here we're looking to improve the rate of energy production and power output. And most of your skills at this point are going to be performed with higher levels of speed and power. And that's really the goals of this period, is to really improve the rate of energy production and the power output, and really work on those sport-specific skills. So everything now becomes highly specific, and everything non-specific becomes accessory. It doesn't mean that everything has to be specific per se, but really when you're looking at it, you're pretty much now, everything else outside of your specific rates of energy system production and whatnot now becomes more accessory in nature. So something is to consider is that sports on the far end of the power endurance spectrum, there tends to be a less variety in skills. So basically, when you look at, say, for instance, so on the far ends here, so sports, what we're saying is, like, for instance, if you look at like Olympic weightlifters all the way on the one end, and you look at marathoners and triathletes on the other, in those particular sports, there's less variety in skills. So for instance, in Olympic weightlifting, you have the clean and jerk and the snatch, and your objective is to just do the most amount of weight. Certainly there's skill in those lifts, but there's not a whole lot you have to deal with energy system wise. Same thing with a marathon runner. When you look at something like soccer, a soccer player or a basketball player or a mixed martial artist, things like that, there's a lot more that comes into play as far as the skills are concerned. So it takes a little bit more planning, and you have a lot more to consider with kind of those, again, mixed-based sports. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. So that in those situations, you're going to want to look to combine the skill work with some of the energy system work if need be. And then in the competitive phase, so here, you're basically looking at, trying to increase the body's ability to produce energy, to working towards to make sure everything is channeled towards the skill of the sport. So that's basically what you're looking to do here. You're trying to take everything you've done conditioning wise, and now you're trying to channel it into sports skills. And from a programming perspective, you want to make sure that you're trying to incorporate as much as you can into the sports skills. Okay. So again, the focus will kind of change as the season moves on. More time early on is used for more like, obviously fundamental skills, and then you get more into tactics and things like that. But you want to make sure that as much as you can, your energy system specific work, getting it into the skill work is probably just as important as anything else. Keep in mind, there is still a place for non-specific work. We want to make sure that we're maintaining general strength, and even, again, some non-specific conditioning, meaning that the conditioning can still work the energy systems, but maybe, again, it's just general sprinting and stuff like that can still be done. But ideally, to make yourself more efficient, it's a good idea to incorporate your conditioning, if you will, into the sport skill practice as much as possible, because then it makes everything much more efficient. Okay, so looking at factors that dictate energy system requirements. So beyond just like work to rest intervals, there's various other things that also dictate energy system requirements. So you're going to be kind of combining the information that I give you here with when we talk about power and capacity of the actual energy systems. So first, obviously, you do want to look at the intensity of the work interval and the duration of the work interval. Okay, so those two things obviously become very important, because obviously the higher the intensity, you're looking at greater contribution from the anaerobic system. And then as you get into the longer duration work intervals, you're looking at more aerobic development. The length of the recovery is going to impact as well. So how long do you have between bouts of energy production? The kinematic and kinetic nature of the movement. So what type of movement are you doing? How much force is involved? How much of your body's involved with the motion? The nature of the range of motion that you're doing. The volume of the overall work. So how much overall work are you doing? And then the density of the work that you're doing, or the amount of work done per unit time. Okay, so in other words, If you do a set amount of work in 20 minutes and then you do that same amount of work in 10, you've basically increased the density of the work. Okay, so that's something that's going to be a factor with energy systems as well. So I'm going to be giving you on the next slides some general recommendations as far as work and rest recovery periods. Again, keep in mind that in addition to those things, you still have to factor these in as well. Okay, and that'll usually be a function of what it is you're doing, but you still have to be looking at that when you're really looking at your energy system requirements. So when we look at power and capacity of your different energy systems, so again, these are some general recommendations as far as timing. Again, you still have to factor in the intensity of the effort and things like that when you're doing it, okay? So alactic power, you look at under 8 seconds, alactic capacity up to 20 seconds, okay? So again, that alactic system is that immediate energy system that we utilize. That's what you look at your time frames there. Lactic power, 20 to 30 seconds. Lactic capacity up to 90. Okay, so this is that anaerobic glycolytic system, and those are your general timelines there. Aerobic power, 90 seconds to 2 minutes. Aerobic capacity greater than 3 minutes. Again, it's important not to confuse effort with intensity. So when you're looking at intensity, if you're doing this, again, it's not as much effort. So this is where we tend to get a little confused with lactic work, and we consider that high intensity. In reality, it's actually not. It might be high effort, but it's not high intensity. So that's something to consider when you're looking at determining kind of how you're doing your programming based upon what the athletes are actually doing. So your rest periods, you're talking alactic power at maximum intensity, you're looking at about anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes. High intensity, about 3 minutes. Alactic capacity, max intensity, 30 seconds to a minute to about a minute and a half. High intensity, about a minute and a half to 2 minutes. Now, you could also do high intensity with shorter recovery periods. So this is when you're doing higher volume and you're doing more density. But in order to do this, you need to utilize what's called a series arrangement. We're actually going to go over in class some examples of these so you could kind of see practically how they're getting used when we do this. We're going to do a little class activity where I show you like a type of athlete's training, and then you're based on the guidelines I've given you, you're going to determine what exactly it is they're working. So you'll get to see some of these in practice. Again, these are the general guidelines that I want you to know for testing purposes. For lactic power, high intensity 6 to 10 minutes, moderate intensity about 2 to 3. Lactic capacity, we look at high 5 to 6 minutes, or 3 minutes if you're using a series arrangement, and then if you're using a series arrangement, you can also go shorter. So again, part of this is determined based upon how long the actual work and the intensity of the bout is. But these are just different examples that you can see regarding the lactic system. And then for moderate intensity, about 1 to 2 minutes. Now for aerobic power, max VO2 about 30 seconds to 3 minutes, high intensity 40 to 60 seconds, and then gradually increasing, you look at 3 minutes for aerobic power. Aerobic capacity, max VO2 about 1 to 6 minutes, high intensity 20 minutes. If you're doing fartlek, it's going to be varied. So again, with fartlek training, you're usually kind of doing higher intensity periods with lower intensity periods as well. And if you're doing uniform, it's not applicable because you're really not doing any resting anyway. Uniform just being that you're just kind of carrying it on prolonged for a period of time. So really there's no rest interval anyway, so it's not applicable. So again, the importance of the energy system and the nervous system. So again, you're going to be looking also at the intensity at which you're doing things. So again, speed, the power levels that you're doing things at are going to be very important. And again, athletic performance at different levels. So again, even for a marathon runner, they do need to perform some speed and power work because again, in the end, marathon runners, even though we classically think of it as as distance duration work, it's still important for them to do some higher intensity training as a part of what they do to help improve, because in the end they want to finish their races as fast as they can as well. But obviously the aerobic work becomes the most important because that's pretty much predominantly what they do. And as I said, if we, again, you look at your spectrum of athletes, you have your athletes on your extreme ends, okay? So in looking at energy systems and how they do for those much more focused sports, okay? So for instance, all the way on the one end of intensity, we have weightlifting, powerlifting, we have the high intensity field events like your throwers, even your short sprints would fall into that. And all the way on the other end, you have your marathon runners, your triathletes. They're the extreme end of the aerobic. And then in between is where it gets a little kind of trickier to program. But again, you can kind of look at predominantly where the sport is at to determine, you know, during those phases of training, how you want to kind of progress them through. So these are your learning outcomes. And again, as I said, we're going to do an activity in class when we kind of look at some practical applications of this, so you can get a really good picture of, you know, how we use these energy systems in our training programs.